What would you do if your peaceful evening turned into a police incident, all because of one bitter neighbor? It started as the perfect night. A warm summer evening, the smell of grilled food drifting through the air, the sound of clinking glasses and laughter filling the backyard. It had been months since my family had been able to get together like this. Between work, school, and life constantly pulling us in different directions, this reunion was something we had all been looking forward to. The kids ran in and out of the house, chasing fireflies while the adults sat back with drinks in hand, sharing stories and reminiscing. The music played at a comfortable volume, not too loud, just enough to add to the atmosphere. But across the street, someone was watching. Karen. She had always been that neighbor, the kind who found something to complain about no matter how small. Trash cans left out a minute too long. She'd send an email to the HOA. A car parked slightly over the curb. She'd take a picture and threaten to call the city. But tonight, she had taken a personal interest in our gathering. The first sign of trouble was the knock at the door. Sharp, impatient, demanding. I opened it to find Karen standing there, arms crossed, lips pressed into a tight line of disapproval. "This is unacceptable," she snapped before I could even greet her. "The music is way too loud. People are trying to sleep." I blinked, momentarily caught off guard. It wasn't even late, barely past 9. I glanced toward the backyard, where my family was laughing and chatting over the gentle hum of music. It was hardly a rager. "Karen, we're just having a small get-together," I said, keeping my tone polite. "No one else has complained." She cut me off with a dramatic shake of her head. "I don't care. Turn it down, or I'll call the police." And just like that, she spun on her heel and stormed back across the street, muttering something under her breath. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. She was being ridiculous, but I didn't think much of it. That was my first mistake. The second was assuming she wouldn't actually go through with her threat. 15 minutes later, the distant wail of sirens cut through the night air. The laughter died down, the music stopped, and a cold dread settled over me. Flashing red and blue lights reflected off the windows as the first patrol car rolled up to my house. This wasn't just a petty complaint anymore. Karen had escalated things in the worst way possible. The police officer stepped out of the patrol car, his face unreadable as he adjusted his belt and approached the house. The entire gathering had gone silent, the weight of a dozen eyes settling on me as I took a deep breath and walked toward him. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with sheer disbelief. "Evening," the officer said, glancing at the people behind me. "We received a noise complaint." I could already feel Karen's smug gaze burning into my back from across the street. She had done it. She had actually called the cops over a family gathering. I forced a steady breath and kept my voice level. "Officer, we're just having a small reunion with family and close friends. The music isn't excessive, and it's not even past quiet hours." The officer nodded, his expression neutral as he took in the quiet, orderly scene around him. People stood in small groups, drinks in hand, chatting in hushed voices now that the tension had set in. No chaos. No out-of-control party. Just a normal evening that had been rudely interrupted. Before the officer could say anything else, the sound of another door slamming rang through the air. Karen stormed out of her house, her robe tied tightly around her waist, arms crossed in smug satisfaction. "I told you," she said, voice carrying far louder than our music ever had. "This is a family neighborhood. We will not tolerate this kind of behavior." The officer turned toward her, raising a hand for her to calm down, but she wasn't finished. "They've been blasting music for hours. I can't sleep. No one can sleep. This is outrageous." Her voice wobbled in a way that only a true complainer could manage, as if she had personally suffered an unspeakable tragedy instead of mild background noise. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. "Officer, no one else has complained." Just her. The officer looked between us, then passed me toward the backyard where my guests had now fallen completely silent, watching the scene unfold with expressions ranging from amusement to disbelief. He rubbed the bridge of his nose and sighed. "Look, I just need to confirm everything's under control. Are you willing to lower the music a little?" I wanted to argue. I wanted to point out how absurd this was. But I knew the fastest way to get rid of this pointless drama was to comply. "Fine," I said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "We'll turn it down." Karen's face twisted with outrage. "That's it? That's all you're going to do? Just let them off with a warning?" Her hands balled into fists as if she expected the officer to slap us all in handcuffs and drag us away for the crime of enjoying our own home. The officer's patience was visibly thinning. "Ma'am, they're cooperating. There's no need for further action." Karen's mouth opened as if she wanted to argue, but she must have realized that throwing a tantrum at a police officer wouldn't work in her favor. She let out a dramatic huff, spun on her heel, and stomped back toward her house. The officer gave me a nod before heading back to his patrol car, clearly eager to escape the absurdity of it all. As the police car pulled away, I turned back to my guests. Some shook their heads, chuckling under their breath at the ridiculousness of it all. Others muttered about Karen wasting everyone's time. The tension lifted slightly, but something nagged at the back of my mind. Karen had been too angry, too desperate to get us into trouble. This wasn't just about the music. This was personal. And deep down, I knew she wasn't done yet. The rest of the night continued, but the energy had shifted. The music was softer now, not because we feared another interruption, but because the entire ordeal had left an odd taste in everyone's mouth. My relatives laughed and shook their heads at Karen's absurdity, but I could feel it lingering, the knowledge that she wanted to win this battle. And she wasn't about to let this go. By morning, I realized just how far she was willing to take it. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a neatly printed note taped firmly to my mailbox. The letters were in bold, blocky font, the kind that screamed passive-aggressive hostility. "Your family has disturbed this neighborhood enough. Keep your parties to yourself or face serious consequences." I scoffed, shaking my head. Serious consequences? What was she planning, an all-out war? I crumpled the note and tossed it aside, trying not to let it get under my skin. But by the afternoon, it became clear, Karen was just getting started. I had been in the backyard, clearing up the last remnants of the party, when I noticed something strange near the fence line. At first, I thought it was just leftover debris from the night before, but as I walked closer, I realized it was intentional. Garbage. Piles of crushed beer cans, food wrappers, even broken glass had been dumped right along my property's edge. My jaw clenched as I surveyed the mess. It hadn't been there the night before, which meant someone had placed it there in the early hours of the morning. And there was no doubt in my mind about who was responsible. Karen had lost the first battle, and now she was shifting tactics. If she couldn't get the police to punish us, she would find other ways to make our lives miserable. I cleaned up the mess without a word, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me react. But I knew this was only the beginning. That evening, just as the sun dipped behind the houses, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of water splashing against pavement. I rushed to the front yard just in time to see a figure retreating toward Karen's house, a large bucket in hand. My driveway was soaked, puddles formed where the liquid had gathered, spreading in dark, wet streaks across the concrete. I stepped forward, sniffing the air, and instantly recoiled. Bleach. Karen had poured bleach across my driveway. My fists clenched, my jaw tightened. This wasn't just petty anymore. This was calculated. She was sending a message. Letting me know she wasn't done making my life miserable. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. She wanted me to react. She wanted me to storm over and yell, to give her another reason to call the police. I wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I pulled out my phone, snapped a few pictures, and walked back inside. If she wanted to play dirty, I was going to be ready for it. I spent the next hour scrubbing through my security camera footage, my pulse steady but my mind racing. There, clear as day, was Karen, her silhouette moving across my driveway, a bucket sloshing in her hands. She had made a mistake, and now I had proof. I debated my next move carefully. Calling the police was the obvious choice, but Karen would twist the story. She'd play the victim, insist it was a misunderstanding. No, I needed something bigger. Something she wouldn't see coming. Instead of going straight to law enforcement, I sent the footage directly to the homeowners association. Along with it, I attached a formal complaint detailing Karen's harassment, the false police report, the threats, the bleach, the garbage dumped along my property. Then I waited. Less than 24 hours later, I received a response. The HOA had reviewed my complaint. They had seen the footage. And, for the first time, they were taking action. A formal warning was issued against Karen, citing her actions as inappropriate, disruptive, and in violation of community standards. Karen had spent years weaponizing the HOA, filing complaints, twisting rules to suit her needs. But now, the very system she relied on had turned against her. And I knew that would only make her angrier. That night, I double-checked my security system and locked my doors, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't finished. Sure enough, the next morning, the real psychological warfare began. It started small. A car alarm blaring outside my house at 3 a.m. When I checked the footage, I saw Karen, standing just beyond my property line, staring toward my house like a statue. She wasn't doing anything, not technically, but the message was clear. The next day, my morning newspaper vanished before I could grab it. Then I found another pile of garbage, this time, closer to my front porch. Each act was designed to be just small enough that I couldn't take legal action. But Karen wasn't content with being subtle for long. That afternoon, I walked outside and the smell hit me first. A sharp, rancid stench that curled into my nostrils and settled deep in my stomach. My lawn was littered with raw meat, rotting, glistening under the summer sun. I stared, bile rising in my throat. It wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately thrown the meat onto my property. And I knew who. I grabbed my phone, took pictures, and cleaned up the mess without a word. Karen was pushing, daring me to react, to give her ammunition. But I wasn't going to play her game. Instead, I added another complaint to the HOA. This time, I included all the footage, all the evidence. The committee wasn't just annoyed now, they were furious. Karen had been issued a formal warning just days ago, and she was already continuing her harassment. By evening, the HOA had called an emergency meeting. I didn't have to wait long to hear the fallout. Karen stormed out of her house just before sunset, phone pressed to her ear, voice shrill with rage. She was arguing with someone, pacing back and forth on her driveway, gesturing wildly. My guess? Someone from the board was tearing into her. Then, as if sensing my gaze, she froze. Slowly, she turned her head toward me, her eyes locking onto mine. For a brief moment, the world stood still. And then she did something I never expected. She smiled. Not a smirk, not the smug satisfaction she wore when she thought she had won, but something colder. Calculated. A chill ran down my spine. Karen wasn't backing down. She was planning something bigger. I just didn't know what yet. The following morning, a thick, uneasy silence hung over the neighborhood, the kind that settled just before a storm. I had woken up expecting retaliation, but instead, there was nothing. No car alarms, no garbage, no Karen standing in the dark watching my house. It should have felt like relief, but instead, it felt like the quiet before an ambush. I didn't have to wait long. A certified letter from the HOA arrived in my mailbox that afternoon. At first, I assumed it was the official response to my latest complaint against Karen. But when I opened it, my blood ran cold. It was a petition to have me removed from the neighborhood. I read it twice, certain my eyes were playing tricks on me. The document claimed I was a disruptive presence, hostile to the community, and in constant violation of HOA policies. The wording was carefully chosen, nothing outright accusatory, but designed to paint me as a neighborhood menace. Attached to the letter was a list of signatures from homeowners who supported the petition. Karen had taken her vendetta to the next level. She wasn't just trying to harass me anymore. She was trying to destroy my place in this community. My hands tightened around the pages, my heartbeat drumming in my ears. I wasn't surprised that Karen had started this, but what stunned me was the signatures. Some of my neighbors had actually signed it. Not all of them, many of the names I recognized as people Karen had either manipulated, guilt-tripped, or outright intimidated into compliance. Still, it stung to know that some people had believed her lies enough to try and force me out of my own home. I took a deep breath, steadied my hands, and did what I should have done from the beginning. I compiled everything, the security footage, the photos of vandalism, the false police reports, the bleach, the raw meat, the absurdity of her escalating behavior. And then I submitted it all in an official case file to the HOA. The response was swift. That evening, Karen got a visit from the HOA president himself. I watched from my front porch as she opened the door, her face morphing from arrogance to barely contained rage as the conversation unfolded. She tried to argue, tried to play the victim, but the president wasn't buying it. The HOA board had reviewed everything. And for the first time, Karen was out of options. The next day, an email arrived in my inbox. The HOA had rejected Karen's petition against me. But more importantly, they had issued a final warning against her. One more violation, and she would be removed from the HOA board entirely. Karen had spent years ruling this neighborhood, using her position in the HOA to make everyone's lives miserable. She had twisted every rule to serve her own needs, weaponized regulations, bullied homeowners into submission. Now, that power was slipping through her fingers. And she knew it. That evening, just after the sun had dipped below the rooftops, I stepped outside to check my mail and saw Karen standing at the edge of her driveway, staring at my house. Not a word was spoken between us, but her posture said everything. She wasn't just furious. She was desperate. That night, at exactly 11:57 p.m., a heavy, deliberate pounding rattled against my front door. I already knew who it was before I even turned the knob. Karen stood on my porch, her expression unreadable, her fists clenched at her sides. But this time, she wasn't screaming. She wasn't ranting or throwing accusations. She just stared at me. And then she leaned in ever so slightly and spoke, her voice a whisper filled with quiet venom. "You think this is over?" A chill ran down my spine. "You have no idea what's coming." And with that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I had won the battle. But somehow, I knew Karen wasn't done. The silence didn't last. It never does with people like Karen. 3 nights later, at exactly 4 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of screeching tires. I threw on a jacket and rushed to the window just in time to see the taillights of a dark sedan peeling away from my house. My stomach twisted as I stepped outside, my pulse hammering in my ears. And then I saw it. Thick red paint, slashed across my garage door, dripping in chaotic streaks. And beneath it, in jagged, hurried letters. "Get out." The smell of fresh chemicals burned my nostrils as I stared at the message, my jaw tightening. This wasn't some petty act of revenge anymore. This was personal. This was a warning. But Karen had made a mistake. She had forgotten about my security cameras. I didn't hesitate. I called the police. By the time the flashing red and blue lights painted the quiet street, I had already pulled up the footage. The officer took one look at the grainy but undeniable silhouette of Karen, the car that matched the description of her own, the bucket in her hands, and nodded grimly. This wasn't just a dispute anymore, this was criminal. Karen was arrested at dawn. The entire neighborhood woke to the sight of two officers leading her, handcuffed, down her front steps. She screamed, she kicked, she called me every vile thing she could think of. But for the first time, no one came to her defense. The neighbors, once too afraid to speak out, watched in silence. Some exchanged quiet glances. Others simply turned away. Her reign was over. The final blow came days later. The HOA issued an official eviction notice. Karen had 30 days to sell her house and leave the neighborhood she had once ruled like a tyrant. She had spent years terrorizing people, bending the rules to her will, weaponizing power against anyone who dared challenge her. And now? She had lost everything. The night she finally left, I stood on my porch, watching as the moving truck pulled away. For the first time in a long time, the street felt quiet. Peaceful. No prying eyes. No complaints. Just a neighborhood finally free from the grip of its worst resident. I took a slow breath, let it settle in, and turned back inside where my family was gathered, laughing and talking. Another small get-together. A celebration, not just of the night, but of finally reclaiming our home. Because this time, no one was coming to shut it down. But it makes me wonder, how many more Karens are out there, waiting for their next victim? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA rules or nightmare neighbors? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.